Over 200 million Americans woke up trapped under the same invisible lid. In New York City, Central Park hit 100 degrees for the first time in 14 years. Roads buckled, trains slowed. Then scientists ran the numbers and found something chilling. This heat had crossed a line the human body was never built to cross. If a story like this keeps you curious, take a second to like and subscribe. Now step under the dome with me, we begin. By sunrise, the air already felt thick and heavy, warmer at 6 in the morning than most days manage at noon. Across the eastern two-thirds of the country, more than 200 million people opened their eyes to the same suffocating heat. That is roughly 6 out of every 10 people in the United States, all pinned under a single weather pattern at the same moment. Picture a blanket the size of a continent, pulled tight from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast, and no way to kick it off. This was the summer of 2026, and the calendar had barely reached the 4th of July. Families were packing coolers for barbecues, kids were lining up for fireworks, soccer fans were pouring into stadiums for World Cup matches, and over all of it sat a dome of hot air so large and so stubborn that forecasters reached for a word they save for the worst events: historic. The heat did not arrive gently. It built for days, then locked into place and refused to move. In city after city, the thermometer climbed into the upper 90s and past 100. But the raw temperature was only half the story. The air was soaked with moisture, and that combination pushed the so-called feels-like number, the heat index, to between 105 and 115 degrees across a huge stretch of the map. In some spots it felt hotter than a summer afternoon in the deep desert, except here it came wrapped in humidity thick enough to drink. Emergency officials in state after state sent out the same blunt warning. Stay inside, drink water, check on your neighbors. In Missouri, the state emergency agency told people to take immediate action the moment anyone showed a sign of heat sickness. Parts of Iowa, Missouri and Kansas sat under extreme heat warnings, the highest level forecasters can issue. A National Weather Service tool built to measure exactly this danger flagged roughly 165 million Americans as facing major or extreme risk to their health. Think about what that number means. 165 million is close to half the population of the entire country, all told by their own government that the air outside their door could hurt them. The warning reached their backyards, their bus stops, their apartments with no air conditioning. And here is the part that makes this event stand apart from an ordinary hot week. The heat kept its grip even after dark. Overnight lows in many places stayed above 75, sometimes above 80 degrees. The body counts on cool nights to recover, to bring its core back down before the next brutal day. This dome took that recovery away. Day after day, the heat just kept stacking. For most people, it looked like a miserable holiday weekend, sweaty, sticky, uncomfortable. But underneath the surface, something more serious was unfolding. Scientists watching the numbers were about to run a calculation that would reveal a truth far darker than a ruined barbecue. This dome had pushed conditions toward a threshold researchers have warned about for years, a line drawn by human biology itself. To understand why, we first have to understand what a heat dome really is, and why this one behaved like a lid slammed down on a boiling pot. So what exactly was pressing down on half a country? Picture the atmosphere as an ocean of air, and imagine a mountain of high pressure rising up inside it, miles tall and hundreds of miles wide. That mountain of high pressure is the heart of a heat dome. Here is how it forms. High in the sky, a giant ridge of warm air bulges upward and parks itself over the land. Inside that ridge, the air slowly sinks toward the ground, and sinking air does something sneaky. As it falls, the weight of the atmosphere above squeezes it, and squeezing any gas heats it up. You have felt a small version of this if you have ever pumped up a bicycle tyre and noticed the pump grow warm in your hand. The same physics, scaled up to the size of a continent, cooks the air on its way down. That sinking, warming air acts like a lid clamped over a pot. It traps heat near the surface and refuses to let it escape. Clouds struggle to form, because rising air is what builds clouds, and here the air is falling instead. So the sky stays a hard, cloudless blue, and the sun beats down without a single shield for hour after hour, day after day. The ground bakes, the air near the ground bakes, and the lid holds it all in. The longer the dome sits, the worse it gets. because heat piles onto heat with nowhere to go. Each morning starts a little warmer than the last. This is why a strong heat dome stacks hot afternoons back to back, each one building on the leftover warmth of the day before. There is a second ingredient that holds the whole thing together, and it lives far above our heads. The jet stream, a fast river of wind that circles the planet, normally keeps weather moving, sweeping hot and cool patches past us in turn. But when the jet stream buckles into a big lazy loop, it can trap a ridge of high pressure underneath it and pin it in place. The weather stops flowing, the dome stalls, and whatever sits below it, in this case tens of millions of homes, gets stuck under the same broiling sky with no relief in sight. That is the difference between a passing hot spell and a dangerous heat dome. Movement. A normal hot day comes and goes. A heat dome overstays, sometimes for a week or longer, and that stubbornness is what turns uncomfortable into deadly. Meteorologists have a name for this stuck pattern. They call it a blocking high, because it blocks the normal march of weather. And in the summer of 2026, a blocking high settled over the central and eastern United States and simply would not budge. Forecasters could see it coming days out. They watched the models paint the same stubborn ridge again and again, and they knew what it meant for the people underneath. So the mechanism is almost simple. Sinking air, a trapped ridge, a lid on the pot. Yet from that simple recipe came a heat so intense that in one of the most famous parks in the world, the thermometer touched a number it had refused to reach for almost 14 years. And the story of that single reading tells you how rare and how serious this event truly was. On a Thursday in early July, a temperature sensor in the middle of New York City did something it had refused to do for almost 14 years. In Central Park, the green rectangle at the heart of Manhattan, the thermometer climbed all the way to 100 degrees. The last time that happened was July of 2012. An entire childhood had passed between those two readings. Central Park matters here for a reason most people never think about. Its weather station is one of the longest running in the country, with records stretching back well over a century. When a place with that much history hits a mark it has touched only a handful of times, meteorologists pay attention. It signals that the day was extraordinary, measured against generations of summers, and New York had plenty of grim company. Up and down the eastern seaboard, town after town shattered its own records. Atlantic City, New Jersey, hit 105. Baltimore's Inner Harbor reached 103. Washington's National Airport touched 102, and the next day the capital climbed to 103. Raleigh, North Carolina matched that. Williamsport, Pennsylvania and Salisbury, Maryland joined the triple-digit club too. On the 4th of July itself, city after city set a brand new daily high, as if the whole coast had agreed to break the same record at once. Then came the peak. On the 4th of July, Atlantic City reached 106 degrees, the hottest single reading of the entire event, 41 degrees Celsius for anyone watching from outside the country. That is a number you expect from a desert, yet here it landed on a boardwalk town on the Atlantic shore where the ocean is supposed to keep summers in check. But the daytime highs, dramatic as they were, hit a quieter and more dangerous record. In Caribou, Maine, far up near the Canadian border, the overnight low refused to fall below 71 degrees. That tied the warmest night that town had ever logged, in data reaching back to 1939. A place famous for cold could not cool off. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, the low on one night stayed at 81 degrees, tying the warmest night in records that reach back to 1872, before electricity lit most homes. Sit with that for a moment. Some of these towns keep weather logs older than the light bulb, older than the telephone, and the thing breaking their oldest records was often the warmth of the night, the very hours the human body relies on to cool down and repair. New York's 100 degrees grabbed the headlines, because a big round number in a famous park makes for an easy story. But the deeper alarm spread across dozens of these smaller stations, each quietly logging a summer unlike almost any in its long memory. Line them up, and they stop looking like a run of bad luck. They start looking like a pattern. A single record can be a fluke, a quirk of one hot afternoon. Dozens of records falling together across 1,000 miles in the space of a few days tell a different story. They tell you the whole system had shifted into a hotter gear. Which raises the obvious question: what pushed the system there? To answer that, we have to climb miles above the ground and follow the river of wind that decides where our weather goes and where it stays. To find the engine behind the dome, look up, way up, about 7 miles above your head, where passenger jets cruise. There, a ribbon of wind wraps around the whole planet, blowing from west to east at speeds that can top 100 miles an hour. Scientists call it the jet stream, and in many ways it is the conductor of our weather. The jet stream forms along the border between cold air to the north and warm air to the south. That clash of temperatures drives the wind. When the difference is sharp, the jet stream runs fast and straight, and it herds storms and cool fronts briskly across the map. Weather stays on the move. No single patch of sky gets to overstay its welcome. The jet stream also bends. Sometimes it wobbles into deep waves, giant loops that swing far north and far south like a rope shaken loose. When one of those loops bulges northward, it leaves a pocket of warm high pressure sitting underneath, and that pocket can get pinched off and trapped. The wind that would normally sweep it along instead curls around it, holding it in place. The weather stops marching. It parks. This is exactly what happened over the United States. A big ridge bulged up over the central and eastern states, and the jet stream looped far to the north over Canada, leaving the dome to bake everything below with no push to move it along. Forecasters watched the same stuck shape hold for days, and the ridge did more than trap heat. It also acted like a giant traffic barrier, shoving the jet stream and its cooler, stormier weather up and out of the way. While the east roasted, that displaced river of wind dumped its energy elsewhere. Up in Canada, the pattern helped fuel enormous thunderstorms. On Canada Day, the 1st of July, storms tied to this same setup flooded parts of Ontario and Quebec, knocking out power to 100,000 homes and drowning Ottawa under more than 4 inches of rain in a single day. One weather pattern, 2 opposite disasters. Broiling drought on one side, flooding on the other, both flowing from the same buckled wind. Here is the detail that should catch your attention. Scientists have noticed that these deep, stuck jet stream loops seem to be showing up more often. One leading idea points to the far north. The Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the planet, several times faster in fact. That shrinks the temperature gap between north and south, the very gap that keeps the jet stream fast and straight. Weaken the gap, some researchers argue, and the jet stream grows lazier, wobblier, more likely to stall into exactly the kind of loop that traps a heat dome for a week. The science here is still being debated, and honest researchers will tell you the picture is far from settled. But the direction of concern is clear. A warming world may be a world where the weather gets stuck more easily, where domes linger longer, where a bad week stretches into a dangerous one. So the dome had its engine, a stalled river of wind miles overhead. Yet the wind alone does not explain why this heat proved so punishing to the human body. For that, we need to talk about the invisible passenger riding along with the heat. Water. Your body has one main tool for beating the heat: sweat. When you get too warm, your skin releases water, and as that water evaporates into the air, it carries heat away with it. Evaporation is the whole trick. It is how a swamp cooler works, how a wet towel on your neck cools you, how a panting dog and a sweating person solve the same problem. Turn liquid into vapor, and you steal heat in the process. But that trick has a weakness, and the heat dome exploited it perfectly. Evaporation only works when the air has room to accept more moisture. When the air is dry, your sweat vanishes quickly and cooling comes easy. When the air is already thick with water, your sweat has nowhere to go. It clings to your skin, drips, and cools almost nothing. The soggier the air, the weaker your best defense. This is why forecasters kept talking about the heat index, the feels like temperature. The heat index blends the actual air temperature with the humidity to estimate how hot your body truly experiences the day. During the dome, air temperatures in the upper 90s combined with heavy moisture to push heat index values to between 105 and 115 degrees across a vast area. In plain terms, a 98-degree afternoon punished your body as if it were 110. There is a specific number that reveals how loaded the air was. Meteorologists track something called the dew point, which measures how much water vapor the air holds. A dew point of 70 degrees marks a genuinely muggy, oppressive day. During this event, large regions saw dew points climb to 70 and beyond, turning the whole atmosphere into a warm, wet sponge. In the Midwest and Northeast, that kind of soaking humidity shows up on fewer than a third of summer days. Here it came stacked on top of record heat. Think about what that does to a body trying to cool itself. On a dry desert afternoon, even at very high temperatures, sweat can still evaporate and buy you time. Under this dome, the sweat mostly stayed put. People poured out water and got little relief for it, which is a dangerous trap because you can lose huge amounts of fluid while your temperature keeps climbing anyway. You feel like you are cooling down. Your body is quietly overheating. This is also why the heat proved so democratic in who it threatened. A dry heat, the kind Phoenix knows, is brutal, but at least lets the body fight back through sweat. Humid heat removes that escape hatch. It reaches the young athlete on a soccer field and the elderly person in a still, airless apartment alike, because it disables the one cooling system every human shares. And the humidity did one more cruel thing. Water vapor traps heat, which means humid air holds on to warmth long after sunset. So the muggiest regions were also the ones where the nights stayed hottest, denying people the cool recovery hours they needed most. The same moisture that blocked their sweat by day smothered their sleep by night. Scientists have a way to fold heat and humidity into a single, sharper measurement, one designed to reveal the exact edge of what a human body can endure. It is called the wet bulb temperature, and it turns a miserable heat wave into a matter of life and death. Once you understand it, you understand why researchers looked at this dome and saw a line being approached. Imagine wrapping a wet cloth around a thermometer and swinging it through the air. As the water on the cloth evaporates, it cools the thermometer down, and the reading you get is the wet bulb temperature. It sounds like a strange laboratory trick, but that simple, soggy thermometer is one of the most important measurements in all of climate science because it does something no ordinary thermometer can. It shows you exactly how well a human body can cool itself. Here is why that matters. Your skin is, in a sense, a living wet bulb thermometer. You cool yourself by evaporating sweat, the same way that cloth cools by evaporating water. So the wet bulb temperature of the air around you is a direct measure of the coolest your skin can possibly get by sweating. If the wet bulb temperature is low, your sweat evaporates freely and you stay comfortable. As it climbs, your cooling weakens, and if it climbs high enough, your sweat stops working altogether, no matter how much you drink or how still you sit. That is the terrifying part. There is a ceiling. A wet bulb temperature exists at which your body simply cannot shed heat anymore, because the air is too hot and too wet to accept another drop of moisture. Past that point, your core temperature has only one direction to go, up, and a rising core temperature, held long enough, is fatal. For years, scientists have used a specific figure as the outer wall of human survival. A wet bulb temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, held for 6 hours. The idea came from a landmark study in 2010 by two researchers, Stephen Sherwood and Matthew Huber. Their reasoning was elegant and chilling. At that wet bulb temperature, they argued, the air is so warm and so saturated that sweat can no longer pull your core below its own safe temperature. With no cooler place to escape to, a healthy adult would overheat and die within hours. To grasp how brutal that combination is, consider what 95 degrees wet bulb actually looks like in the real world. It could mean 95 degrees of air temperature at 100% humidity, or it could mean a scorching 115 degrees at 50% humidity. Either way, it is a wall of heat and moisture that turns the open air into something closer to a sealed sauna you cannot leave. For a long time, this threshold felt almost theoretical, a line the planet had rarely if ever crossed for long. A climate scientist who led a major study on the subject found that this limit had been touched only around a dozen times in recorded history, mostly in South Asia and around the Persian Gulf, and never for more than about 2 hours at a stretch. Short enough that no mass death event had ever been tied directly to it. So for years, the 95-degree wall stood as a distant warning, a marker of a future we hope to avoid. Solid, reassuring. A bright red line still sitting safely in the distance. And then a group of researchers decided to test whether that famous wall was actually built in the right place. They put real human beings into a heat chamber and pushed them toward the edge. What they found redrew the line entirely and moved the danger much, much closer to where we already live. To find out if the famous survival wall stood in the right place, researchers at Pennsylvania State University did something bold. Instead of trusting a formula, they tested it on real people. They built a heat chamber, a room where they could dial the temperature and humidity to any level they wanted, and they invited in young, healthy volunteers, the kind of people who should handle heat better than almost anyone. Then they slowly turned up the misery and watched what happened inside each body. Every volunteer swallowed a tiny sensor that measured their core temperature from the inside, a telescope pointed at the deepest, most protected warmth of the human body. The scientists were hunting for one exact moment, the point where a person's core temperature stopped holding steady and began an unstoppable climb. They called that tipping point the critical environmental limit. It is the instant the body loses the fight and starts, in effect, to slowly cook itself. Everyone expected the volunteers to hold out until the wet bulb temperature reached the famous 95-degree wall. That was the theory, after all, the line drawn in 2010. The results stunned them. Not one volunteer made it to 95. Their bodies broke down far earlier. In humid conditions, the average critical limit landed near a wet bulb temperature of around 87 degrees, several full degrees below the line the world had been trusting for over a decade. And these were young, fit adults with no health problems, sitting still, given every advantage. The real edge of survival, it turned out, sat much closer than anyone had promised. Later work sharpened the warning even more. Other researchers built detailed models of human physiology and folded in the things the original formula ignored, like age and sun exposure. Their findings pushed the danger line lower still, especially for older adults standing in direct sunlight. For an older person out in the sun in dry heat, the survivable limit could sit 10 degrees or more below the classic 95. The neat, distant wall dissolved into something jagged and frighteningly near. Then came the study that mattered most for real life. A team including scientists who study heat in the human body took a newer, more precise survival model and aimed it at 6 actual heat disasters from history. Real events where real people died. The question was simple and brutal. During those disasters, did conditions cross the true survival line, even in hours the old 95-degree rule would have called survivable? In all 6 cases, they did. During a deadly heat event in Mecca, conditions became non-survivable for people over 65 standing in the sun for around 1 out of every 8 hours across the period studied. In a heat disaster in Larkana, that figure climbed higher still, and the grim math matched what actually happened on the ground. People died, mostly the elderly, in exactly the conditions the older rule would have waved off as safe. Put all of this together and the picture flips. For years we pictured a bright red line waiting far off in a scary future. The chamber, the models, and the death records revealed the truth. That line was never a distant wall. It was a soft, shifting edge, and for the most vulnerable among us, it sits much closer to everyday summer heat than almost anyone realised. Which is why the exact way a body fails in that heat is worth understanding. Because it explains why, once the line is crossed, there is no drinking your way out and no toughing it through. Let us walk through what actually happens inside a person when the heat wins. It is a quiet emergency, and it moves in stages, and understanding those stages explains why extreme humid heat kills people who never saw it coming. Your body runs best at a core temperature right around 98.6 degrees. It guards that number fiercely, because the delicate machinery inside your cells, the proteins that run every process keeping you alive, only work within a narrow band of warmth. Push the core too high, and that machinery starts to warp, the way an egg white turns solid and white in a hot pan and can never turn back. When you first get hot, your body fights back with 2 main moves. It sends more blood to the skin so heat can radiate away into the air, and it opens the sweat glands to flood your skin with cooling moisture. On a normal hot day, this works beautifully. You flush, you sweat, you cool. But under a humid heat dome, both defenses stumble. The air is nearly the same temperature as your skin, so radiating heat away barely works. And the air is so full of water that your sweat will not evaporate, so your best weapon fires blanks. You are pouring sweat, losing precious water and salt and getting almost no cooling in return. This is the trap. The body works harder and harder for a payoff that never comes. Now the core temperature begins to creep up. At first you feel it as heat exhaustion, dizziness, a pounding heart, nausea, weakness, skin that is clammy and pale. Your body has pulled so much blood to the surface trying to cool down that your brain and organs start running low on supply. Many people at this stage make a fatal mistake. They push through it, telling themselves it is just a rough afternoon. If the heat keeps winning, the body crosses into heat stroke, and this is where it turns deadly. The core climbs past 104 degrees. The cooling systems, overwhelmed, can shut down entirely. In some cases, the person stops sweating altogether, and the skin goes hot and dry. The brain, cooking now, begins to fail. Confusion sets in, then slurred speech, then collapse and seizures. Without fast, aggressive cooling, the organs break down one after another, and the person dies. The cruelest detail is the speed and the disguise. Because humid heat blocks your cooling without feeling as scorching as dry desert heat, people underestimate it. They feel sweaty and tired, not endangered. They keep working, keep walking, keep sitting in a hot apartment with a fan pushing warm air around, and their core temperature climbs the whole time without any dramatic signal to stop. This is why the survival line matters so much. It is not a number on a chart. It marks the exact conditions where this deadly cascade becomes impossible to escape through willpower or water. Below the line, a healthy body can hold steady. Above it, the core simply rises, hour by hour, no matter what you do. So when scientists said this heat dome pushed toward that line, they were describing this exact biological failure spreading across a continent. And that raised an urgent question. Was this monstrous heat just nature having a bad summer? Or had something tilted the odds? A team of scientists set out to answer that, and their finding was blunt. When a heat wave like this hits, people ask a natural question. Was this just bad luck? The kind of freak summer that has always happened now and then? Or did something make it worse? For a long time, scientists could only shrug and say it was hard to blame any single weather event on a warming planet. That answer is no longer good enough, because a whole new branch of science has been built to give a sharper reply. It is called attribution science, and it works a bit like a detective comparing two worlds. In the first world, the real one, greenhouse gases from burning coal, oil and gas have thickened the atmosphere and trapped extra heat. In the second world, a computer-built copy, those gases were never added, and the climate stays as cool as it was before the Industrial Age. Scientists run thousands of simulations of both worlds, then ask a simple question. How much more likely, or how much more intense, did our pollution make this exact event? After the Eastern Heat Dome, a team ran one of these rapid attribution studies on the very combination of extreme heat and heavy humidity that had just tormented the coast. Their conclusion did not hedge. They found that the event, as it actually unfolded, would have been essentially impossible without the greenhouse gases humans have poured into the sky. In the cooler, cleaner world, this particular disaster simply does not happen. Sit with that word. Impossible. Not made a little more likely, not nudged a few degrees warmer. The specific, brutal blend of heat and moisture that pushed millions toward the survival line belonged to a world we built. We did not just load the dice. We carved a new number onto them that could not have come up before. This fits a pattern scientists have watched grow for years. Around the globe, heat waves are becoming more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting, and the fingerprint of human warming shows up on them again and again. The record-shattering heat that struck Europe just weeks earlier, and the strange off-season heat that hit the western United States back in March, both carried the same signature. Extreme heat has become the clearest, most measurable symptom of a warming planet, the place where the change stops being abstract and starts being something you can feel on your skin. There is a reason heat responds so sharply to warming. When you nudge up the average temperature of the whole planet, even by a seemingly small amount, you do not just shift the middle, you stretch the entire range of possible weather toward the hot end. Days that used to be rare and extreme become common. Days that used to be impossible become the new extreme. A small shift in the average produces a huge jump in the number of dangerous days at the far edge, and humid heat gets a double boost because warmer air holds more water vapor. For every degree the air warms, it can carry several % more moisture. So a hotter world is not only hotter, it is muggier, which means those dangerous wet bulb temperatures, the ones that shut down the human body, climb faster than temperature alone would suggest. So the answer to the question is in. This was not simply nature, our hand was on it. Which brings us to the heart of this whole story, and the reason this particular dome deserves the word dangerous. It crossed a line that older heat waves, for all their misery, never quite reached. Here is the line this dome crossed, and why it separates this event from the sweaty, miserable summers of the past. For most of human history, extreme heat was survivable almost everywhere, given shade, water, and rest. It was cruel, it was exhausting, but the human body, with a little help, could hold its ground. The dangerous line is the point where that stops being true, the point where shade and water and rest are no longer enough, and the air itself becomes uncompensable, a word scientists use for heat the body cannot balance out no matter what it does. Older American heat waves, even famous killers, mostly stayed below that line for the healthy. They pushed the elderly and the sick past their limits, which is tragic and real, but a young, fit adult in the shade could usually endure them. What made this dome different was the collision of three things at once: record daytime heat, suffocating humidity that crippled sweating, and warm nights that erased recovery. Stacked together, those three pushed conditions in places toward the true survival threshold. The closer one revealed by the heat chamber, the edge where even the strong body starts to lose. Remember the number the volunteers actually hit. A wet bulb temperature around 87 degrees, not the old 95. That lower, truer wall sits much closer to a bad American summer than the old formula ever suggested. When a dome delivers triple-digit heat indices for days, over a region soaked in 70-degree dew points, with nights that never cool, it stops being merely uncomfortable. It starts brushing against the biological edge, especially for anyone older, sicker, or stuck without air conditioning. And this is the shift that alarms scientists. The dangerous line used to live in distant places, the Persian Gulf, parts of South Asia, corners of the world where humid heat had always flirted with the extreme. Now, in a warming climate, that line is creeping toward the middle latitudes, toward ordinary towns in ordinary countries, toward Baltimore and Raleigh and the cornfields of the Midwest. This dome was a preview, a demonstration that the conditions once reserved for a handful of the planet's hottest corners can now assemble themselves over the heart of a temperate nation. Think of it like a river slowly rising against a levee. For decades, the water stayed comfortably below the top, and everyone assumed it always would. The dangerous line is the top of that levee, the survival threshold of the human body. What this event revealed is that the water is now high enough, in the worst moments, to lap at the edge. It has not swept over the whole region for 6 straight hours, the full catastrophe the survival studies describe, but it climbed high enough, in enough places to prove the levee is no longer as tall as we thought, and the river is still rising. That is what makes this a line worth naming, not because everyone under the dome dropped, they did not, but because the conditions crossed from the realm of survivable with effort into the shadow of survivable for some. The event marked the moment the theoretical danger stopped being theoretical and set up camp inside a normal American summer. And nature was not finished making the point. Even as the first dome loosened its grip on the east, satellites and forecast models caught something that made the scientists watching lean closer. A second dome was already taking shape, and it was rising over a different part of the country entirely. The eastern dome had barely begun to relax when the atmosphere started building its sequel. Around the 6th of July, forecasters watching the model spotted a fresh ridge of high pressure, swelling over the western half of the country. The pattern was reloading, and this time the target was the west. This matters more than it might sound, because back-to-back domes are a different kind of threat than a single event. When the atmosphere slips into a rhythm of building one ridge after another, it means the underlying setup, the buckled jet stream, the loaded warmth, has not reset. It has simply shifted its aim. The country was not getting one bad week and a return to normal. It was getting a summer that kept finding new places to punish. The trigger was a major change in the weather pattern. The same wavy jet stream that had trapped heat in the east swung into a new configuration, pulling the river of wind up and out of the country and into southern Canada, and letting a big dome of high-pressure balloon over the west instead. Forecasters warned that high temperatures would run 10 to 15 degrees above normal, and this during July, already the hottest month of the year. In some spots, the heat threatened to climb within a few degrees of the highest temperatures ever recorded there. The heart of this western dome centered on the Rockies in the interior west, where the air is drier but the raw temperatures can be staggering. Widespread readings in the upper 90s and low 100s were forecast from the Rockies into eastern Oregon, with the worst heat pushing toward 105 degrees across parts of Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Only the immediate west coast, cooled by the ocean breeze, looked set to dodge the worst, and the western dome carried a danger the eastern one mostly lacked: fire. The west was already tinder dry, gripped by drought, with wildfires that had burned more than 3 million acres across the country so far that year, well above the normal pace. Most of that burning had scorched the west, with destructive fires already tearing through parts of Colorado and Utah in the preceding weeks. Layer a brutal heat dome on top of drought-parched land, and you bake the vegetation into fuel, just waiting for a spark. There was one small mercy in the setup. Because a heat dome is a mound of high pressure, it tends to calm the winds beneath it, and wind is what turns a small fire into a racing wall of flame. So while the heat threatened to dry everything to a crisp, the gusty winds that fan the worst fire disasters were less likely under the dome itself, a dangerous situation, held one notch back from catastrophe by a quirk of the same pressure pattern causing it. The bigger meaning was in the sequence: east, then west. Two enormous domes, one after another, sweeping across the country like a 1-2 punch, each rewriting temperature records in its own region. This was the shape of a summer running hot at a continental scale, the atmosphere unable to settle, passing the misery from coast to interior and back. And at the burning centre of the western heat sat a city that has become a symbol of living on the edge of what humans can endure. A place that regularly touches temperatures most of us will never feel. When the new dome bore down, that city climbed toward a number that tests the very limits of a modern metropolis. The city is Phoenix, Arizona, and it lives in a relationship with heat that no other large American city can match. Sprawled across the Sonoran Desert, home to millions, Phoenix has built an entire civilization in a place where summer routinely tops 110 degrees. It is a bold experiment in whether modern technology can let a huge population thrive in conditions that would have been unlivable a century ago. And when the Western Dome arrived, that experiment faced one of its hardest tests. As the ridge built in early July, Phoenix climbed to 113 degrees and held there across several days. That is 45 degrees Celsius, a temperature at which the air itself feels like an open oven when you step outside, and the pavement grows hot enough to cause serious burns on contact. Firefighters in the city treat sidewalk burns as a real medical emergency, because a person who falls and cannot get up on that ground can be badly injured in minutes. Phoenix survives its brutal summers on one thing above all: air conditioning. In a desert city at these temperatures, air conditioning is not a comfort. It is life support. The cool interiors of homes, stores, and offices are the shaded oases that make the whole city possible. Take that away, even for a while, and Phoenix would become one of the most dangerous places in the country almost overnight. This is why a heatwave and a power failure form such a terrifying pair. The heat is what makes the electricity essential, and the heat is also what strains the grid most. Phoenix has learned this the hard way and prepared more than most. The city runs cooling centres, tracks heat deaths carefully, and has even created offices devoted specifically to managing extreme heat. It is, in many ways, a glimpse of the future, a place already living with the kind of heat that other cities are only beginning to face. What Phoenix does to survive today, more and more of the country may need to copy tomorrow. But even Phoenix has limits, and they are not far away. Recall the survival research. In dry, sunny conditions like the desert, the danger line for an older person standing outside can sit well below the old 95-degree wall. Phoenix gets away with its extreme dry heat, partly because that heat, brutal as it is, still lets sweat evaporate, buying the body time. But push the temperature high enough, add a little humidity from a summer monsoon surge, and even that escape hatch narrows. The city's whole survival strategy depends on staying just inside a shrinking margin, and the margin is shrinking. Phoenix has been warming faster than the country as a whole. its nights especially refusing to cool as the sprawling city of concrete and asphalt holds the day's heat like a stone left in a fire. Some recent summers have brought stretches of days that never dropped below 90 degrees even at night, denying residents the cool hours their bodies need to recover. The desert experiment is being run at a higher and higher setting. Phoenix, then, is the canary in the coal mine, a place already living at the edge and watching that edge press closer. Its struggle points to a harder truth about all of this heat. The danger does not stay outside on the pavement. It reaches into the systems we depend on, the wires and rails and machines that hold modern life together. And under this dome, those systems began to bend, continuing. Chapters 13 through 18 move from the human body out into the machinery of modern life, and then to the question of who pays the price. When a heat dome settles over a continent, tens of millions of people reach for the same switch at the same moment, the air conditioner, and that simultaneous grab for cooling puts a strain on the electric grid unlike almost anything else it faces. The very thing keeping people alive in the heat is the thing most likely to fail because of it, and that cruel loop sits at the centre of every modern heat disaster. Think about what an air conditioner really does. It is a machine that pumps heat out of your home and dumps it outside, and doing that takes a lot of electricity. On a mild day, only some homes run their units. Under a dome, nearly every home, store, office and hospital runs them hard for hours, through the night, all at once. Demand for power surges toward the highest levels of the entire year, sometimes setting records for how much electricity a region has ever pulled at one time. Now here is the trap. The same heat that spikes demand also weakens the supply. Power plants run less efficiently when the air and water they use for cooling are already hot. Power lines sag and lose capacity as they warm, carrying less electricity than they can on a cool day. Transformers, the humming boxes that step power down for neighbourhoods, can overheat and fail. So at the exact moment the grid is asked to deliver more than ever, its ability to deliver quietly shrinks. Supply falls as demand climbs, and the gap between them is where blackouts are born. During this event, the strain showed up across the country. The system groaned under the load, and in places the pressure broke through. Up in Canada, where the same pattern spawned violent storms, the failures were dramatic. In Quebec, 100,000 homes lost power at the peak of the heat, and by the next morning 50,000 still sat in the dark. In Halifax, tens of thousands more went without electricity during dangerous warmth. Each of those darkened homes was a place where the cooling had just switched off, where the indoor temperature would begin to climb toward the deadly conditions outside. That is the nightmare scenario emergency planners lose sleep over. A blackout during a heat dome is far more dangerous than a blackout in mild weather, because it strips people of their only defense in the moment they need it most. An elderly person in a hot apartment with no power, no fan, no cool air, can slide from uncomfortable to critical in a matter of hours. The wet bulb math does not care whether the lights are on. It only cares about the heat and the moisture, and without electricity there is nothing to hold either at bay. There is even a grim feedback loop hidden here. As blackouts knock out cooling in some areas, the people there may crowd into other cooled spaces, or the grid operator may scramble to shift power around, and the whole delicate balance grows more fragile. A single failure can cascade, tripping protective switches and spreading darkness outward like a crack across glass. So the grid became a quiet battlefield during the dome, holding the line in most places, buckling in others, and the electricity was only the first of our built systems to feel the heat, because the same physics that saps a power line also attacks the steel and concrete we move through every day. The heat was about to reach down and grab the rails and roads beneath our feet. Heat does something to solid materials that most of us never think about until it goes wrong. It makes them grow. Steel, concrete, asphalt, nearly everything expands as it warms, swelling slightly in every direction. On a normal day, the change is too small to notice. Under a dome that bakes surfaces for days, that quiet swelling becomes a force strong enough to break the systems we ride on every morning. Start with the railroads. A steel rail sitting in the summer sun can grow far hotter than the air, soaking up sunlight until it is painful to touch. As the steel heats, it stretches, and a rail that is pinned in place with nowhere to expand can start to bend and warp sideways. Engineers call the result a sun kink, a section of track that has buckled out of its straight line. A train hitting a sun kink at speed can derail, so railroads take the threat seriously. During the Eastern Dome, Amtrak, the National Passenger Rail Service, slowed its trains through the Northeast Corridor, the busy stretch of track linking the big coastal cities. Slower trains put less stress on warped rails and give crews a better chance to spot trouble, but they also mean delays rippling across the schedule, thousands of travellers stuck as the system deliberately eased off to stay safe. Roads suffer too. Asphalt softens in extreme heat, growing rutted and sticky under the weight of traffic. Concrete highways, made of rigid slabs, can do something more violent. When the slabs expand and push against each other with nowhere to go, the pressure can force a section to suddenly heave upward and shatter, a phenomenon called a blowout. A road can quite literally explode into a jagged ramp, dangerous for any car that hits it. Bridges, built with special joints to allow for expansion, can jam or bind when the heat pushes them past their design. Even the sky was not spared. Extreme heat thins the air, and thinner air gives airplane wings less to push against, which can force airlines to reduce weight or delay flights until conditions ease. The whole web of transportation, the rails and roads and runways we treat as permanent and reliable, turns out to have a temperature at which it starts to fight back. Here is the deeper worry. Most of this infrastructure was designed and built for the climate of the past. Engineers set their tolerances based on the hottest days their region used to see, with a margin of safety on top. But as the extremes climb higher than the old records, that built-in margin gets eaten away. Systems that were perfectly safe for a century of summers are now being pushed toward the edge of what they were ever meant to handle. The rail that never kinked, the road that never blew out, was built for a cooler world that is slipping away. And repairing or upgrading all of it, hardening a nation's rails and roads and grids against a hotter future, would cost staggering sums and take decades. So for now, on the worst days, the systems simply slow down, brace, and endure, the way the trains crawled through the northeast under the July sun. Machines can be repaired, people are more fragile, and the heat does not touch everyone equally. As the dome pressed down, it revealed something uncomfortable about who suffers most, and why the danger so often stays hidden until it is too late. A heat dome falls on everyone, but it does not treat everyone the same. The same air that leaves one person merely sweaty can kill another, and the difference comes down to age, health, money, and circumstance. Understanding who the heat comes for first is the key to understanding why it kills so quietly, often without the sirens and rubble of other disasters. Start with the body itself. As people age, their ability to regulate temperature fades. Older adults sweat less, sense heat less sharply, and often carry medical conditions or take medications that further blunt their defenses. Remember the survival research, where the danger line for an older person in the sun sat well below the line for a young one. That is not a statistic. It is a grandparent in a warm apartment whose body simply cannot shed heat the way it once could. Across heat waves worldwide, the elderly die in numbers far out of proportion to their share of the population. The very young are vulnerable too. Small children heat up faster than adults because they are tiny compared to the amount of skin they have, and they depend entirely on grown-ups to keep them cool and hydrated. This is why a child left in a hot car, even for minutes, faces mortal danger. The same math, slower but just as real, threatens any child without relief from the heat. Then there are those with illness. People with heart disease, lung disease, kidney trouble, or diabetes all face heightened risk, because heat stress piles new strain onto systems already struggling. Officials during the dome singled out those with breathing problems, warning that the thick, humid air, sometimes fouled further by wildfire smoke drifting east, would hit them hardest. But the cruelest divide is not medical, it is economic. Heat is, in a quiet way, one of the most unequal of all disasters. The person with a well-insulated home and reliable air conditioning rides out the dome in cool comfort. The person who cannot afford to run the unit, or has no unit at all, or has no stable home to cool, faces the full force of the heat. Studies of heat deaths find them clustered among the poor, the isolated, and the elderly living alone. People who may have no one to check on them and no cool place to flee to. This is why officials keep repeating one simple instruction during every heat wave: check on your neighbours. That knock on a door has saved more lives than almost any technology. Outdoor workers stand exposed by the nature of their jobs. Farmhands, construction crews, delivery drivers and warehouse staff cannot simply retreat inside when the heat index passes 110. Their bodies climb toward the danger line while they labour, and the pressure to keep earning can override the warning signs their bodies are screaming. This uneven toll is exactly why heat is so often called a silent killer. It does not flatten buildings or make dramatic footage. It slips into quiet homes and takes the frail, the poor, and the alone, one by one, often out of sight. A person who dies of heat may be found days later, their death attributed to their heart or their age, the true culprit hidden. And that hidden quality points to a disturbing truth about the numbers themselves. When officials announced the death toll from this dome, the figure they gave was almost certainly far smaller than the real one, for reasons woven into how we count the dead. By the 8th of July, officials had tied around 44 deaths to the heat wave. It is a sobering number. It is also, almost certainly, a dramatic undercount, and the reasons why reveal one of the most stubborn problems in all of heat science. The true toll of a heat dome hides in plain sight, scattered across death records that rarely name heat as the culprit. Here is the core problem. Heat usually kills indirectly. It rarely leaves an obvious mark like a wound or a broken bone. Instead, it pushes a struggling body over an edge it was already near. An elderly man with a weak heart dies of a heart attack during the dome, and his death gets recorded as heart failure, with no mention of the 100-degree day that triggered it. A woman with lung disease dies as the humid, smoky air overwhelms her breathing, and the certificate reads, respiratory failure. The heat was the hidden hand behind both deaths, and in both cases it goes uncounted. Because of this, scientists have learned that the official heat death tally captured in real time is only the tip of the iceberg, the handful of cases so clearly caused by heat stroke that no one can miss them. The far larger toll shows up only later, and only through a clever statistical trick called excess mortality. The idea is simple and powerful. Researchers look at how many people normally die in a given region during a given week of summer, based on years of records. Then they count how many actually died during the heat wave. The gap between the two, the excess, reveals the heat's true reach. Again and again, when scientists run this analysis after a major heat event, they find that the real death toll dwarfs the official one, sometimes by a factor of 10 or more. A heat wave officially blamed for dozens of deaths may, in truth, have killed thousands. This is why heat is so dangerously underestimated in the public mind. A hurricane announces its toll in real time, with wreckage everyone can see. A heat dome hides its dead in the ordinary flow of death certificates, its victims counted under other causes, its true scale revealed only months later in a quiet statistical study that few people ever read. By then the summer has passed, the story has faded, and the lesson goes unlearned. The pattern holds across the biggest heat disasters in history. A European heat wave 2 decades ago was eventually found to have killed tens of thousands, far more than anyone realised as it was happening. More recent events have followed the same script. The initial count is small and reassuring. The final reckoning, arrived at slowly, is staggering. So when we hear that a heat dome caused 44 deaths, we should read that number as a floor, not a ceiling. It is the count of the most obvious cases, gathered in haste. The real figure, hidden in the excess deaths that will only be tallied later, is a shadow we cannot yet see clearly, but can be almost certain is larger, perhaps far larger. This hidden toll makes heat uniquely treacherous among natural disasters. It kills at scale while barely registering as a crisis, which means the pressure to prepare and protect never quite matches the danger. And the danger, driven by a warming climate, is being amplified further by a natural ocean pattern that had just roared to life, loading the dice for an even hotter year ahead. While human warming steadily raises the baseline, nature runs its own cycles on top, and in 2026 one of the most powerful of those cycles had just switched on. It is called El Niño, and understanding it explains why forecasters were bracing not just for a hot week, but for a potentially historic hot year. El Niño is a shift in the vast Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on the planet. Normally, winds along the equator push warm surface water toward the western Pacific, near Asia and Australia, while cooler water rises to the surface off South America. During an El Niño, those winds weaken, and the warm water sloshes back eastward, spreading a huge pool of unusually warm water across the tropical Pacific. It sounds like a distant watery event, but the consequences ripple across the entire globe. Here is why it matters for heat. The ocean holds staggering amounts of warmth, and during a strong El Niño, some of that stored heat escapes into the atmosphere. The result is that El Niño years tend to be the hottest years on record globally, because the planet's largest ocean is in effect breathing out extra heat. Layer that onto the steady warming from greenhouse gases, and you get a powerful 1-2 punch, a naturally hot year stacked on a human-heated climate. In June, the United States National Weather Service confirmed that El Niño conditions had arrived and raised the possibility of what forecasters informally call a super El Niño, an especially strong version of the pattern. Climate scientists warned that under these conditions the world should expect higher temperatures and a greater likelihood of heat waves through the year. The heat domes of early July, in other words, were arriving at the start of a year already tilted toward extremes. Think of it like this. Human-caused warming is a slow, steady rise in the tide, lifting the whole ocean of global temperature year after year. El Niño is a large wave riding on top of that risen tide. On its own, a wave comes and goes, but a big wave arriving on an already elevated tide reaches heights that neither could reach alone. It is the combination that produces the record-shattering years, the summers that break-mark scientists thought would stand for decades. This helps explain a pattern that had been unfolding all year. The record-crushing heat that struck Europe just weeks earlier, the strange, out-of-season heat that hit the western United States back in March, months before summer even began. These were not isolated flukes. They were the early signs of a climate system running hot on multiple levels at once, the steady human push and the surging natural cycle reinforcing each other. And El Niño does more than raise temperatures. It reshuffles weather patterns worldwide, shifting where rain falls and where drought deepens, nudging the jet stream into new configurations, sometimes making the stuck, blocking patterns that trap heat domes more likely. Its fingerprints spread across floods and fires and storms on every continent. So the domes of 2026 were not a summer acting alone. They were the opening act of a year primed for heat, with a powerful ocean cycle amplifying an already warming world. If this was July, forecasters feared, the months ahead could bring worse. And there was one particular danger that El Niño's heat, combined with the dome's drought, made especially menacing. Across the parched western landscape, all that superheated, moisture-starved air was turning the land itself into fuel. Return your attention to the western half of the country, where the second dome was baking a landscape already primed to burn, because heat and fire share a dangerous partnership, and under the dome that partnership grew teeth. To understand the wildfire threat, you have to see how a heat dome prepares the land, drying it into fuel long before the first spark ever flies. Every living plant, every tree and shrub and blade of grass holds moisture. That moisture is what keeps it from catching fire easily. Green, well-watered vegetation resists flame, because a fire must first boil away all that water before the plant can truly burn. But bake the land under a heat dome, day after day of 100-degree air and relentless sun, and the plants lose their moisture to the thirsty atmosphere. They dry from the inside out, turning from living, fire-resistant greenery into brittle, tinder-dry fuel. The dome, in effect, is a machine for curing a forest into kindling. The West in 2026 was already dangerously dry. Much of the region sat locked in drought, its soils and forests parched from too little rain over too long a stretch. Fires had already burned more than 3 million acres across the country that year, a pace well above normal, with the worst of it in the West. Destructive blazes had torn through parts of Colorado and Utah in the weeks before the dome even arrived. The land was primed, and the heat dome was pouring on the final layer of dryness. There was one saving grace, and it came from the very shape of a heat dome. Because a dome is a mound of high pressure, the air beneath it tends to sink and settle, which calms the winds. And wind is the great multiplier of wildfire, the force that turns a small flame into a racing wall of fire, hurling embers ahead to start new blazes miles away. Under the dome, those violent winds were less likely, which meant that while the heat dried everything to a crisp, the worst fire-spreading conditions were held partly in check. A dangerous situation, restrained one notch by the same pressure pattern causing it. Yet the respite was fragile. Heat domes do not last forever, and when one breaks down, the change in pressure can kick up exactly the kind of winds that were suppressed while it rained. The transition, the moment the dome collapses and the weather pattern shifts, can be the most dangerous time of all, unleashing gusts across a landscape the dome has spent days drying into fuel. The calm is temporary, and what follows the calm can be an inferno. There was another twist. As the western dome strengthened, it began pulling in some moisture from the south, the leading edge of the summer monsoon. That moisture could tamp down temperatures a little, a small mercy, but it carried its own danger. Moist air rising over the hot land can build thunderstorms, and thunderstorms in a dry landscape often bring lightning without much rain, natural ignition sources striking down onto tinder-dry fuel. The very moisture that eased the heat could light the fires the heat had prepared, so the western dome sat at the heart of a vicious equation. Bake the land dry, hold the calming winds for now, then risk unleashing both the wind and the lightning as the pattern shifts. The stage was set for fire in a way that the heat itself had carefully arranged, and this collision of heat and human activity was about to play out on one of the largest stages in the world, where crowds of people from every corner of the planet stood gathered, exposed, under the same relentless sun. Continuing. Chapters 19 through 24 widen the lens from the crowds under the dome out to the fields, the oceans, and the whole planet. Of all the terrible timing this heat dome carried, one collision stood out. The summer of 2026 was a World Cup summer, and the tournament had drawn enormous crowds from every corner of the earth into the very cities the dome was roasting. Picture the scene. Stadiums packed with tens of thousands of fans, players sprinting across open fields with no shade at all. And above it all, the same lid of heat pressing down on a 4th of July weekend. A soccer match is one of the most physically brutal things a human body can do in the heat. Players run for miles over 90 minutes, their muscles generating tremendous internal warmth, their bodies straining to dump that heat into air that has stopped accepting it. Under a heat index climbing past 110 degrees, that becomes genuinely dangerous. An athlete's core temperature can spike toward the failure point far faster than a person sitting still, because their own effort is adding heat from the inside even as the dome blocks their cooling from the outside. The organisers knew the risk and adjusted. Matches at the exposed East Coast venues came with warnings, with extra water breaks written into the play so athletes could pause, drink and try to shed some heat. Players took shade whenever the game allowed. Fans in the stands were urged to hydrate constantly and watch for the warning signs of heat sickness in themselves and the people around them. A festival of sport had become, in part, an exercise in heat survival. Think about the crowd itself, apart from the players. Tens of thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder in an open bowl of concrete that soaks up the sun and radiates it back. Stadiums can become heat traps, their hard surfaces storing warmth, and their dense crowds generating still more body heat, with little airflow to carry it away. Among that many people, there are always some who are older, some who are ill, some who did not drink enough water, some who travelled from cooler climates, and never learned to respect this kind of heat. In a crowd that large, under a dome that fierce, the odds that someone crosses their personal danger line climb steadily through the afternoon. This is the quiet, new reality of a warming world. The great outdoor gatherings that define summer, the tournaments, the festivals, the fireworks displays and parades are increasingly running into a climate that makes standing outside in July a genuine hazard. Event planners now have to think like emergency managers, stocking water, opening cooling zones, watching the heat index the way a sailor watches a storm. The simple joy of a summer crowd is being reshaped by the need to survive the summer air, and the World Cup was only the most visible example. Across the country that weekend, the same danger played out at a smaller scale everywhere. Backyard barbecues where someone worked over a hot grill in 100-degree air. Parades where marching bands and spectators baked on open pavement. Fireworks shows where families waited outdoors deep into evenings that never cooled below the high 70s. the humidity keeping the danger alive long after dark. A nation's favourite summer traditions, all colliding with a dome that made every outdoor hour a calculated risk. The heat reached beyond the people gathered to celebrate, though. It reached into the ground that feeds them. Out past the stadiums and the cities, across the vast farmlands of the country's heartland, the same dome was pressing down on the crops that fill the nation's tables, and plants, like people, have a temperature at which they begin to fail. Leave the cities behind and picture the great agricultural heartland of the country, the endless fields of corn and soybeans and wheat that stretch across the middle of the continent. This is where a huge share of the nation's food, and much of the world's, is grown. And this vast breadbasket sat squarely beneath the heat dome, its crops facing the same brutal air as the people in the cities, with no way to seek shade or drink from a cooler. Plants, like animals, have temperatures at which they thrive and temperatures at which they suffer. For a crop like corn, extreme heat during the wrong stage of growth can be devastating. When temperatures soar past the mid-90s, especially during the critical weeks when corn is pollinating, the plant's ability to form kernels can falter. Pollen can be damaged by the heat, and an ear of corn that fails to pollinate properly yields far less grain, or none at all. A few days of extreme heat at exactly the wrong moment can quietly erase a chunk of the harvest before the plant ever shows visible damage. Plants have their own version of sweating too. They release water vapour through tiny pores in their leaves, a process that both cools them and pulls water up from their roots. But under extreme heat and bright sun, a plant can lose water faster than its roots can supply it, especially if the soil is already dry. To protect itself from drying out completely, the plant closes those pores, which stops its water loss but also shuts down its ability to take in the carbon dioxide it needs to grow. The plant essentially holds its breath to avoid dehydrating, and while it holds its breath, it stops growing. Bake it long enough and the leaves wilt, scorch and die. The dome brought a double blow to the fields. The heat itself stressed the plants directly, and the relentless sun and dry air pulled moisture out of the soil at a punishing rate, deepening any drought and leaving less water for the roots to draw on. In regions where rain had been scarce, the combination of searing heat and thirsty soil could push crops toward real failure. Farmers could only watch, water what they could, and hope the dome broke before the damage became permanent. The stakes here reach far beyond any single farm. The American heartland feeds not just the country but much of the world, exporting grain to nations across the globe. When a heat dome damages that harvest, the effects ripple outward through food prices and supply, touching dinner tables continents away. A bad heat year in the American Midwest can mean costlier food in cities that have never felt a degree of the dome that caused it. And this is where the slow squeeze of a warming climate grows especially frightening. As extreme heat becomes more frequent and more intense, the reliable harvests that humanity depends on grow less reliable. The crops were bred and the farms were planted for the climate of the past, for summers that stayed within familiar bounds. Push the extremes higher, more often, and the whole delicate system that keeps billions of people fed starts to wobble. The heat, then, threatens us not only through our bodies but through our bellies, striking at the food supply that underpins everything. And to understand why the whole planet is warming this way, why the domes keep coming and the harvests keep facing a risk, we have to look at the enormous silent engine sitting beneath it all. The oceans, quietly absorbing and storing a heat almost too vast to imagine. To understand why the air keeps breaking records, you have to look away from the sky and down into the water. The oceans are the true heart of the climate system, and they hold a secret that explains much of the heat we have been living through. They are absorbing the overwhelming majority of the extra warmth trapped by greenhouse gases, storing it in a way that both shields us and, in time, comes back to haunt us. Water has a remarkable ability to soak up heat. It takes an enormous amount of energy to warm water even slightly, far more than it takes to warm air. This is why the sea moderates the climate of coastal places, why an ocean breeze feels cool, why a lake stays chilly into early summer. And it is why the oceans have quietly swallowed the vast bulk of the heat that humanity's greenhouse gases have added to the planet, more than 9/10 of it. Without that buffer, the air would have warmed dramatically more than it already has. The ocean has been protecting us, taking the punch on our behalf. But that protection has a hidden cost. because heat stored in the ocean does not simply vanish, it waits. And a warmer ocean changes the world in ways that reach right back into the atmosphere. Warm surface waters feed more energy and moisture into the air above them, supercharging storms and adding to the humidity that makes heat waves so deadly. Remember that a hotter, wetter atmosphere pushes those dangerous wet bulb temperatures higher. Much of that extra moisture is evaporating off oceans that are warmer than they have ever been in the modern record. The numbers on ocean heat have grown genuinely alarming. Scientists tracking the temperature of the seas have watched record after record fall, with global sea surface temperatures climbing to levels never before measured. In fact, researchers studying the limits of human heat survival pointed to recent record highs in maximum sea surface temperature as evidence that the dangerous wet bulb conditions they had modelled were becoming real, because those searing ocean temperatures are exactly what can produce the deadly humid heat near the coast. The overheated ocean is not a distant abstraction. It is the source of the moisture that soaks a heat dome and blocks the human body's cooling. There is a slow-motion danger buried in all this stored heat. The ocean warms gradually and releases its heat gradually, which means the warming we have already locked in will keep expressing itself for a long time to come, even decades after emissions slow. The sea is like a vast battery, charging with heat now and destined to discharge it into future summers. Much of the heat behind tomorrow's domes is already in the water waiting, and the ocean's warming does more than fuel humid heat. It drives sea levels higher as the water expands. It stresses the coral reefs and fisheries that feed billions, and it can disturb the great currents that move heat around the planet and keep regional climates stable. The overheated sea sits at the centre of a web of consequences, most of them still unfolding. So the domes over America were, in a sense, the ocean breathing out, a visible flash of a much larger, slower heating happening out of sight beneath the waves. Which raises the question of just how widespread this really is, because the American heat, dramatic as it was only one bright spot on a map of a planet running a fever, and one particular symptom of that fever is quietly reshaping every night we sleep. Among all the ways the world is warming, one change stands out as especially sneaky, because almost no one notices it happening. The nights are heating up faster than the days, and of all the shifts a warming climate brings, this quiet warming of the dark hours may be one of the most dangerous, precisely because it hides from our attention. Think back to the records that fell during the dome. The headlines went to the daytime highs, the 100 degrees in Central Park, the 106 in Atlantic City. But some of the most significant records were the overnight lows that refused to fall. Caribou, Maine, whose night would not drop below 71, tying its warmest ever. La Crosse, Wisconsin, stuck at 81 degrees overnight, tying a record in data reaching back to the 1800s. These warm nights were not a side note, they were a central part of what made this event so punishing. Here is why hot nights matter so much. The human body relies on the cool of night to recover from the heat of day. When the sun sets and temperatures fall, your core temperature comes back down, your heart eases its labour, and your body repairs the strain of the afternoon. This nighttime recovery is a crucial reset, the pause that lets you face another hot day. But when the night stays hot, that reset never comes. Your body never gets to cool down, and the heat stress simply accumulates day after day after day with no relief. This is what turns a multi-day heat dome into a killer. A single scorching afternoon, followed by a cool night, is survivable for most people. But several scorching afternoons in a row, each followed by a night too warm to allow recovery, stack stress on a body until it breaks. The victims of a long heat waves often succumb not on the first hot day but on the third or fourth, after their bodies have been denied recovery for too long. The warm night is the silent accomplice of the deadly day, and globally the trend is unmistakable. Nighttime temperatures have been rising faster than daytime ones in many regions. Several forces drive this. Increased humidity holds warmth through the night, as water vapour traps heat that would otherwise escape to the sky. Cities, built of concrete and asphalt, soak up the day's heat and radiate it slowly through the night, keeping the darkness warm, and the overall thickening of greenhouse gases traps heat around the clock, but its effect is especially pronounced at night, when there is no incoming sunlight to dominate the balance. The result is a world where the cool refuge of night is slowly disappearing, first in the cities, now spreading outward. And because this warming happens while we sleep, out of sight and out of mind, it draws far less attention than a blazing afternoon. Yet in terms of human health, it may be the more important change, because it removes the recovery that makes surviving the heat possible. This hidden warming of the nights is a perfect symbol for the whole crisis, a dangerous change unfolding quietly, at a scale that never quite grabs the headlines, its true cost visible only to those who study it closely. And it is spreading, carrying the danger zone into places that once considered themselves safe from this kind of heat entirely. For most of history, dangerous humid heat was a problem of certain places, the tropics, the Persian Gulf, the great river valleys of South Asia. People in the middle latitudes in places like the United States and Europe could regard the very worst heat as something that happened elsewhere. That comfortable assumption is now dissolving because the danger zone is on the move, creeping outward into regions that always believed themselves safe. Recall the survival research and the true lower danger line the heat chamber revealed. For years, the conditions that could push a body past that line had appeared in their most extreme form only in a handful of the planet's hottest, most humid corners. Those were the places where wet bulb temperatures had ever briefly touched the deadly threshold. The middle latitudes, cooler and often drier, sat safely below. But a warming climate is raising the floor everywhere, and that means the extremes are climbing into new territory. A heat dome that can deliver triple-digit heat indices for days over a region soaked in humidity, with nights that never cool, is now capable of assembling itself over the heart of a temperate nation. The domes of 2026 were exactly this, a demonstration that conditions once reserved for the world's hottest corners can now form over Baltimore and Raleigh and the cornfields of the Midwest. The danger did not travel to those places from somewhere else. It grew there, out of a climate that has shifted beneath everyone's feet. Consider what this means for the people living in these newly exposed regions. Their bodies, their homes, their whole way of life were shaped by a cooler past. Many older homes in traditionally mild climates were built without air conditioning, because for generations it was never truly needed. The people themselves are less acclimatized to extreme heat, having rarely faced it. When a dangerous dome arrives in such a place, it finds a population and an infrastructure utterly unprepared, which can make a given level of heat far deadlier there than in a place long accustomed to it. This is one reason a heat wave in a temperate region can kill so many. When brutal heat struck Europe in past summers, it fell on cities where air conditioning was rare and bodies were unused to such warmth, and the death tolls climbed into the tens of thousands. The heat itself was not always more extreme than what hotter regions endure routinely. The difference was that it landed on the unprepared, and as the danger zone expands, more and more places face exactly this kind of unprepared encounter, with heat they were never built to handle. The expansion works in another direction too, reaching upward in elevation and outward in season. Heat that once stayed confined to the deep summer now shows up in spring and fall, as the strange March heat in the western United States showed. Heat that once spared the cool of higher ground now climbs into the hills and mountains. The safe places, defined by geography and by season, are shrinking on every side. Picture it as a stain slowly spreading across a map, the zone of dangerous heat widening year by year, seeping into regions that coloured themselves safe. Nowhere is being spared this creep entirely, but the newly affected places caught unaware often suffer most. The domes over America were a marker of this spread, a sign that the danger has arrived in the temperate heartland to stay. To grasp just how far this has come, it helps to set this event against the great heat disasters of recent memory, and to see where it fits in a chain of records that keeps growing longer and more alarming. To understand the true weight of the 2026 domes, it helps to place them in a lineage, a chain of extreme heat events that have grown more frequent and more shocking in recent years. Each one, in its time, seemed like a once-in-a-generation anomaly. Together they tell a story of a pattern accelerating, of the extraordinary becoming ordinary. Cast back to the great European heat wave of 2003, an event that stunned the continent. Tens of thousands of people died across Europe, many of them elderly, in cities where air conditioning was rare and no one had prepared for such heat. At the time, it was treated as a freak catastrophe, a horror unlikely to repeat. Scientists later calculated that human-caused warming had made that event far more likely, one of the earliest clear fingerprints of climate change on a specific disaster. It was a warning, and much of the world filed it away as a strange, tragic exception. Then came a heat event that redrew what scientists thought possible. A few years back, an extraordinary heat dome settled over the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Western Canada, regions famous for their mild, cool summers. Temperatures shattered all-time records, not by fractions but by huge margins, climbing far beyond anything the region had ever recorded. A small town in Canada reached a temperature that would be extreme even in a desert, then burned to the ground in a wildfire days later. Scientists studying that event concluded it would have been virtually impossible without human-caused warming, and it forced them to confront a frightening idea that the climate could produce extremes that leapt well beyond the steady upward trend, extremes that broke the old records not by a little but by a lot. That Pacific Northwest event carried a special terror because it struck a region as unprepared as anywhere on Earth for such heat. Bodies unacclimatized, homes without cooling, a population that had never imagined such temperatures. The death toll climbed into the hundreds, and it drove home the lesson that the danger zone was expanding into cool, temperate places once thought immune. And the chain kept growing. Just weeks before the American domes of 2026, Europe endured another bout of record-shattering heat. Months earlier, the western United States had been struck by unusual out-of-season heat back in March, long before summer's official start. Each event added another link, another data point in a pattern that has become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Set against this lineage, the domes over America take their proper place. They did not shatter the very highest records the way the Pacific Northwest event did. In raw extremity, they were not the single worst heat event in memory. But that is precisely what makes them so telling. Their significance lies in their combination and their reach, the way they blended record heat, crippling humidity, and warm nights across a vast populated region, pushing conditions toward the true survival line for millions at once. They were not a freak outlier standing alone. They were a broad, representative sample of what a warming world summers now routinely deliver. That is the deeper alarm hidden in these events. The great heat disasters are no longer rare exceptions separated by decades. They are arriving in a steady, quickening drumbeat, each one a fresh record, each one another step up a staircase that keeps climbing. And the domes of 2026 were simply the latest step, a reminder that the staircase shows no sign of levelling off. To see where that staircase leads, we have to follow the loops and feedbacks built into the system itself, the ways in which a warming world can push itself to warm even faster. Continuing into the final stretch. Chapters 25 through 30 push into the feedback loops, the physiological future, and the hard limits of adaptation. There is a cruel trap hidden inside our response to extreme heat, and it is one of the reasons this crisis is so hard to escape. The main way we protect ourselves from the heat, air conditioning, can end up making the underlying problem worse. It is a feedback loop, a cycle that feeds on itself, and it sits at the uncomfortable centre of the whole story. Here is how the loop turns. As the world warms and heat waves grow more frequent, people install and run more air conditioning, which is entirely reasonable, since for many it is the difference between comfort and danger, even between life and death. But air conditioners consume large amounts of electricity, and in much of the world that electricity is still generated by burning fossil fuels, the very source of the greenhouse gases warming the planet. So the more we cool our homes, the more power we demand, the more fuel we burn, and the more warming we add. Our defense against the heat quietly stokes the fire that creates it. The loop has a second turn that makes it worse. An air conditioner does not destroy heat. It moves heat, pumping it out of your home and dumping it into the air outside. In a dense city packed with air conditioners, all that expelled heat pours into the streets, raising the outdoor temperature of the neighbourhood, especially at night. So the machines cooling the insides of buildings are actively heating the spaces between them, making the city hotter for anyone outdoors and driving up the need for still more cooling. The device that saves the person inside punishes the person on the sidewalk. This is the maddening shape of many climate feedbacks. The problem generates responses that deepen the problem, and air conditioning is only one example. Consider the wildfires the Western Dome threatened. When forests burn, they release enormous stores of carbon that the trees had locked away, adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and nudging the warming further, which in turn dries out more forests and primes them to burn. Fire feeds warming, and warming feeds fire. The oceans offer another turn of the wheel. As waters warm, they become less able to absorb carbon dioxide from the air, and warm water holds less dissolved gas, the way a warm soda goes flat faster than a cold one. So the warmer the ocean grows, the less of our pollution it can soak up, leaving more in the atmosphere to warm things further. The buffer that has been protecting us weakens as we lean on it harder. Even the melting of bright ice plays this game. Ice and snow reflect sunlight back to space, but as they melt and reveal the darker land or water beneath, that darker surface absorbs more sunlight and warms further, melting still more ice. White turns to dark, reflection turns to absorption, and the warming accelerates. These loops are what make scientists so wary of pushing the climate too far. A system full of self-reinforcing feedbacks does not always respond in gentle, predictable steps. It can lurch, can amplify a push into something much larger, can carry itself past points from which return grows difficult. The heat we are living through is not just the direct result of our emissions, it is the result of our emissions multiplied by these loops, each one adding its own turn to the wheel. Understanding these feedbacks is what transforms this from a story about one bad summer into a story about a trajectory. Because if the loops keep turning, the domes of 2026 are not an endpoint. They are a waypoint on a path leading somewhere far more serious, a place where crossing the survival line stops being a rare, fleeting event and starts becoming a feature of the ordinary year. Let us follow that path forward and confront what crossing the survival line really means for the summers to come. Not the single dramatic moment of a wet bulb temperature spiking for an hour, but the slow, grinding future in which those dangerous conditions become more common, longer lasting, and more widespread. This is where the whole story has been leading, and it is worth facing squarely. Recall the core finding that reshaped this entire picture. The true survival line, revealed by the heat chamber, sits lower than the old formula promised, closer to a bad American summer than anyone had assumed. And recall the physiology, the way a body past that line cannot cool itself no matter what it does, its core temperature climbing hour by hour toward heat stroke and death. Now imagine those conditions, which brushed against a continent for a few peak hours during the dome, growing more frequent as the world warms further. Scientists who study this future paint a sobering picture. As global temperatures continue to climb, the number of days each year that cross into dangerous heat is projected to rise steeply, and the regions affected are projected to expand. Places that today face a handful of extreme heat days per year may, in the decades ahead, face many times that number. The rare, record-breaking dome of today becomes the routine, expected summer of tomorrow. What made 2026 remarkable could, in time, become simply what July feels like. The most alarming projections concern the emergence of conditions that cross the true survival line not for an hour, but for the sustained periods that the survival research describes as lethal. In the hottest, most humid corners of the world, scientists warn that such conditions could begin appearing with real regularity later this century, creating windows of time when being outdoors, unprotected, becomes genuinely deadly for anyone. And as the danger zone expands outward, more populated regions come within reach of these once unthinkable extremes. Think about what this would mean for daily life. In the worst affected places, there could be periods when outdoor work becomes impossible, when going outside during the heat of the day risks death, when whole economies and ways of life must reshape themselves around the need to hide from the sun. The rhythms of human life, built over thousands of years around a climate that let us live and work outdoors, would have to bend around a heat that no longer permits it. There is a crucial nuance here that honest scientists always stress. The future is not fixed. These projections depend heavily on how much more warming humanity allows. A world that sharply reduces its greenhouse gas emissions faces a far milder version of this future than a world that keeps burning fossil fuels at full tilt. The difference between those two paths is measured in countless lives, in vast stretches of land that remain livable or do not, in summers that stay difficult versus summers that turn deadly. The path is still, to a real degree, a choice, but the direction of the trend is clear, and the domes of 2026 were a signpost along it. They showed, in real conditions over real cities, that the danger line is no longer a distant abstraction. It is close enough to brush against a temperate nation on a holiday weekend, and every fraction of further warming brings it closer still, transforming a line we occasionally approach into a line we increasingly cross. That future would test the one great defense humanity has against the heat, the ability to shelter, to cool, to hide from the sun. And that defense, powerful as it is, has limits of its own that are worth understanding clearly. When the heat becomes dangerous, humanity's answer is to seek shelter, to find or create a cool space and wait out the worst. Cooling centres, air-conditioned buildings, shaded refuges, these are the front line of survival during a heat dome. But this defense, essential as it is, has real limits, and understanding those limits reveals why extreme heat is a harder problem to solve than it first appears. During the domes, officials across the country urged people toward exactly this defense. Stay indoors, seek air conditioning, visit cooling centres if your home has none, take breaks in air-conditioned buildings or shaded areas. Cities opened public spaces as refuges from the heat, places where anyone could come to cool down. These measures work and they save lives, and they are among the most important tools we have. When a heatwave strikes, getting vulnerable people into cool spaces is often the single most effective thing that can be done. But look closer at this defense and its fragility appears. The whole strategy rests on electricity, on the power that runs the air conditioners that make the cool spaces cool. And as we saw, the heat itself strains the electrical grid toward failure, precisely when the cooling is needed most. A cooling centre is only cool as long as the power holds. A blackout during a heat dome does not just darken homes, it can shut down the very refuges people flee to, turning shelter into trap. There is a deeper limit too, one rooted in inequality. Cooling shelters help only those who can reach them and are willing to go. The most vulnerable, the elderly living alone, the isolated, the frail, are often the least able to travel to a distant cooling centre and the least likely to know it exists or to ask for help. Many of the people who die in heat waves die alone in their homes, never having reached the shelter that might have saved them. The refuge is real, but the path to it is not open to everyone, and there is a limit written into physics itself. Air conditioning works by moving heat from inside to outside, and it needs somewhere to dump that heat. As we saw, in a dense city, this expelled heat warms the outdoor air, but there is a more fundamental concern. Air conditioners themselves become less efficient as the outside air grows hotter, having to work harder to shed heat into an environment that is already scorching. Push the outdoor temperature high enough, and the machines strain toward their own limits, needing ever more power to achieve ever less cooling. Then consider the scale. Shelter is a defense for individuals and communities, but it does nothing to address the heat itself, which continues to bake the crops in the fields, buckle the rails, dry the forest toward fire, and warm the oceans further. You cannot move a cornfield into a cooling centre. You cannot air condition a continent. Shelter protects the person who reaches it, and it is vital, but it leaves untouched the vast web of consequences unfolding across the land. Most fundamentally, shelter is a response to the symptom, not the cause. It is a way of enduring the heat, of getting through the dangerous hours, but it does nothing to slow the warming that makes the heat worse each year. A world that relies entirely on hiding from the heat is a world in which the heat keeps climbing, and the hiding grows harder and more frequent, until the times when it is safe to be outdoors shrink toward nothing. This is why the true solution has to reach deeper than shelter alone, toward the source of the warming itself, and that source, and the choice it leaves us, is where this story finds its urgent, unavoidable conclusion. Beyond the immediate danger to human bodies lies a quieter, vaster cost that the heat exacts on the world, a cost measured not only in lives, but in the enormous drain the heat places on the machinery of human civilization. To grasp the full weight of what these domes represent, we have to widen the lens one more time and see how extreme heat quietly saps the strength of everything humans build and do. Start with work itself. When the heat index climbs past dangerous levels, human labour becomes difficult and then impossible. A construction worker, a farmhand, a warehouse labourer cannot safely work at full effort in 110-degree conditions, and pushing them to do so risks their lives. So work slows, or stops, or shifts to the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. Multiply that across the millions of people whose jobs demand physical effort, outdoors or in uncooled spaces, and the heat becomes a massive brake on human productivity. Scientists estimate that the world already loses vast quantities of working hours to heat each year, and that this loss will grow as the world warms, draining the economic strength of the hottest, often poorest regions most of all. The heat drains the systems we depend on too. Recall the grid straining toward failure, the trains slowing on warped rails, the roads buckling, the crops faltering in the fields. Each of these is a cost, a piece of the vast infrastructure of modern life bending under the heat, requiring repair, reinforcement, or replacement. Hardening a civilization against a hotter future, upgrading the grids and rails and buildings that were designed for a cooler world, would demand staggering sums and decades of effort. The heat presents humanity with an enormous growing bill. There is a cost to health systems as well. Every heat wave sends a surge of people to hospitals and emergency rooms, straining medical services precisely when the heat may also be knocking out their power and challenging their staff. The hidden toll of heat, the excess deaths, the heart attacks and respiratory failures and kidney injuries triggered by the heat, all flow through a healthcare system that must absorb them. As heat waves grow more frequent, that burden compounds, and there are costs that resist any accounting. The strain on the poorest and most vulnerable, who bear the heaviest share of the heat's toll while having done the least to cause it. The slow erosion of the outdoor life that has always been part of what it means to be human. The summers spent hiding indoors, the traditions and gatherings reshaped by the need to survive the air. The anxiety of living in a world where the summers keep breaking records, where each year seems to bring a fresh extreme. Taken together, these costs reveal extreme heat as something far larger than a weather event. It is a quiet, grinding tax on human civilization, extracted in lives and labour and money and comfort, growing heavier with each fraction of warming. The domes over America were a single visible instalment of a bill that comes due, in one form or another, everywhere the heat reaches. Understanding the full scale of that cost is what makes the choice ahead so consequential, because the size of the bill, the number of lives, the amount of labour and land and money at stake all depend on the decisions humanity makes now about the warming that drives it all. We have followed the heat from a single morning under the dome all the way out to the oceans, the feedbacks, and the future. Now it is time to gather what all of this means and understand the true significance of the line these domes crossed, and why scientists chose that stark word, dangerous, to describe it. The domes of 2026 were not the hottest event in history, nor the deadliest, nor the most record-shattering. In raw numbers, other events have surpassed them. Their real significance lies in what they revealed and what they represented. They showed, over real cities filled with real people, that the conditions capable of pushing a human body toward its survival limit can now assemble themselves over the heart of a temperate nation on an ordinary summer weekend. They proved that the dangerous line, once thought to live only in the world's most extreme corners, has crept close enough to brush against everyday life in a wealthy, temperate country. That is the line these domes crossed, not the final catastrophic threshold of sustained lethal heat across a whole region for hours on end, the full nightmare the survival studies describe. The domes did not reach that, but they crossed the line from the theoretical into the real, from a distant future warning into a present-day fact. They demonstrated that the danger is no longer a projection on a scientist's chart. It is a lived reality, arriving in the temperate heartland, pressing on the bodies of millions, and it is drawing closer with every fraction of further warming, and they reveal the trap in how we perceive this danger. Heat kills quietly, hiding its dead in death certificates that name other causes, delivering its worst toll to the frail and the poor and the isolated out of sight. It does not flatten cities or make dramatic footage. So even as the danger climbs, the alarm never quite matches it, and the pressure to act stays weaker than the threat deserves. The domes were a chance to see the danger clearly, to recognise that the quiet killer had reached a new and closer line. The science underneath is settled in its essentials, even as the details continue to sharpen. The world is warming because of the greenhouse gases humans have added to the atmosphere. That warming makes heat waves more frequent, more intense, and more humid. An attribution study found that the specific heat of the Eastern Dome would have been essentially impossible without those emissions. The survival research shows the danger line sits lower and closer than we thought, and the feedbacks and the loaded oceans mean the warming and the heat will keep climbing unless the emissions driving it are brought down. That last point is the hinge on which everything turns. The future is not yet written. The projections that frighten scientists most describe a world that keeps burning fossil fuels at full tilt, allowing the warming to climb ever higher, pushing the danger line across more of the map and crossing it more often. A different path, one that sharply reduces emissions, leads to a far milder future, one in which the heat grows more manageable and the survival line stays, for most places, at bay. The gap between those two futures is measured in an almost unimaginable number of lives. So the domes of 2026 were a message, written across a continent in record heat and warm nights and buckled rails. A message that the danger has arrived, that the line has been approached, and that the choice of how much further to push it remains, for now, in human hands. The question is whether the message will be heard while the choice still matters. Stand back then and see the whole shape of what these domes revealed. A lid of high pressure clamped over a continent. 200 million people trapped beneath it. Records falling in a park that had not seen such heat in 14 years. In towns keeping logs older than the light bulb. Sweat that could no longer cool. A survival line closer than anyone had promised, and a study declaring the whole event impossible without the hand of humanity. This was the anatomy of a warning. The deepest lesson of these domes is about the nature of the threat itself. Extreme heat is the quiet giant among climate dangers, the one that kills the most while frightening us the least. It arrives without the spectacle of a hurricane or the wall of a flood. It slips into still apartments and open fields and crowded stadiums, and it takes its toll in ways that hide inside other numbers, revealed only later in the cold arithmetic of excess deaths. Precisely because it is so quiet, it demands that we make an effort to see it clearly, to recognize the danger that our instincts might otherwise let us overlook, and these domes taught us where the danger now lives. It has left its distant corners and crept into the temperate heart of a wealthy nation, brushing against the survival limit of the human body over ordinary cities on an ordinary weekend. The comfortable belief that the worst heat happened somewhere else to someone else has dissolved. The danger zone is spreading into new regions, new seasons, new nights, and no place watches it approach from a safe distance any longer. Yet within all of this hard truth sits something that is not despair. The future these domes point toward is not fixed. The science is clear that the warming driving the heat comes from a cause we understand and can address, the greenhouse gases we pour into the sky. The most frightening projections describe a world that keeps burning without restraint. A different path remains genuinely open, one that bends the warming downward and keeps the survival line, for most of the world, at bay. The choice between those paths has not yet been made, and every fraction of a degree avoided is measured in lives saved, in land kept livable, in summers that stay difficult rather than deadly. That is the strange gift buried in a dangerous heat dome. It makes the abstract suddenly concrete. It takes a warming measured in fractions of a degree, easy to dismiss as distant and small, and turns it into 100 degrees in Central Park, into a warm night in Maine that would not break, into a survival line brushing against a summer crowd. It lets us feel, on our own skin, what the science has been trying to tell us. And in doing so, it offers a chance to understand the stakes before the worst of them arrive. The heat dome over America crossed a dangerous line. It carried the survival threshold of the human body from a distant future into a present-day summer, and it did so quietly, in an event most people remember only as a hot and miserable holiday weekend. Whether that line keeps advancing, crossing more often and reaching further, or whether it is held back depends on choices still being made. The dome has delivered its warning. What remains is the far harder question of what we do once we have understood it. Bringing it home, the final 3 chapters, then the full description block. If hiding from the heat is only a way to endure it, then the real work lies in preparing for a hotter world, and, at the root, in slowing the warming itself. Adaptation and prevention, the two great responses to this crisis, are worth understanding clearly because together they define the difference between a future we can live with and one we cannot. Start with adaptation, the effort to make our cities and lives more resilient to the heat that is already locked in. Much of this comes down to redesigning the places we live. Cities can be reshaped to fight the heat they trap. Planting trees across a neighbourhood provides shade and, through the plant's own release of water vapour, a genuine cooling effect, turning a baking street into a tolerable one. Painting roofs and pavements in light colours that reflect sunlight rather than absorb it can lower a city's temperature measurably. Building more parks, more green spaces, more water features gives the urban landscape ways to shed heat instead of hoarding it. A city built to breathe stays cooler than a city built of dark, heat-soaking concrete. Buildings themselves can be made to resist the heat. Better insulation, smarter design that catches breezes and blocks the harshest sun, and cooling systems that sip electricity rather than gulp it, can all lower the danger and the strain on the grid at once. In the hottest regions, some of the oldest building traditions, thick walls, shaded courtyards, designs refined over centuries to beat the heat without machinery, are being rediscovered and updated for a warming age. The systems that hold society together can be hardened too. Electrical grids can be strengthened and expanded to survive the surging demand of a heat dome without failing. Rails and roads can be built or upgraded with materials and designs that tolerate higher extremes. Early warning systems can alert communities to dangerous heat days before they arrive, giving people time to prepare, and heat action plans can organise the opening of cooling centres, the checking on vulnerable residents, and the marshalling of emergency services. These preparations save lives, and the places that invest in them fare far better when the heat arrives. But adaptation has a ceiling, and this is the crucial point. We can adapt to a somewhat hotter world, softening the blow through smart design and careful planning. Yet if the warming keeps climbing without limit, it will eventually outpace our ability to adapt. There is a level of heat beyond which no amount of shade or cooling or planning can keep a place livable, a point where the survival line is crossed too often and too widely for adaptation to hold. Adaptation buys us safety and time, but only within limits, and those limits shrink as the warming grows, which is why the deepest response reaches past adaptation to prevention, to slowing and eventually halting the warming itself. That means addressing the root cause, the greenhouse gases pouring into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, shifting the world's energy towards sources that do not release those gases, using energy more efficiently, and protecting the forests and oceans that absorb carbon are the ways humanity can keep the warming and the heat from climbing without end. Prevention is the only response that addresses the cause rather than the symptom, the only path that keeps the survival line from advancing further across the map. Adaptation protects us from the heat we cannot now avoid. Prevention determines how much heat there will ultimately be. We need both, and the balance between them, how much we must simply endure versus how much we can still prevent, depends on choices being made right now. And there are choices too that fall to each of us in the moment a dome descends. When a heat dome bears down and the danger is immediate, the response comes down to specific practical actions that can mean the difference between life and death. These are the things that save people in the moment, and they are worth knowing clearly, because a heat dome does not wait for policy or planning. It arrives, and it must be survived. The first and most important defense is staying cool and hydrated. Drinking water steadily, before thirst even strikes, replaces the fluids the body loses trying to cool itself. Seeking out air conditioning, whether at home, in a public building, or at a cooling centre, gives the body an environment where its cooling can actually work. When air conditioning is not available, even simple measures help. A cool shower or bath, a wet cloth on the skin keeping windows shaded during the day, staying in the lowest and coolest part of a home. A fan alone can be tricky, because in very hot air it may just blow warm air around, but paired with dampened skin or a nearby cool space it can aid the body's cooling. Timing matters enormously. The heat of the day, especially the afternoon, is the most dangerous stretch, so limiting outdoor activity to the cooler hours of the early morning or evening can keep a person out of the worst danger. Physical exertion in extreme heat is especially risky, since the body generates its own heat through effort, so heavy work or exercise is best avoided when the heat index climbs into dangerous territory. Officials during the domes urged exactly this, telling people to limit prolonged outdoor exposure and take frequent breaks in cool spaces. Recognizing the warning signs of heat illness can save a life, one's own or another's. The early signs of heat exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, a pounding heart, heavy sweating, weakness, cool and clammy skin are the body's signal to stop, cool down, and rehydrate immediately. The signs of heat stroke, which is a true medical emergency, include confusion, slurred speech, a very high body temperature, and skin that may turn hot and dry as sweating fails. Heat stroke demands calling for emergency help and cooling the person as fast as possible while waiting, because every minute counts once the body's cooling has collapsed. Perhaps the single most powerful action, though, costs nothing at all: checking on the vulnerable. The elderly, the isolated, the sick, and those living alone are the ones most likely to die in a heat dome, often because no one realized they were in trouble until it was too late. A simple knock on a neighbor's door, a phone call to a relative, a visit to make sure an older person's cooling is working and their water is within reach has saved countless lives. Officials repeat this plea in every heatwave for a reason. In a disaster that kills quietly, in still apartments, out of sight, the attention of another person is often the thing that breaks the silence and brings help in time. These individual actions do not solve the larger crisis, but they are how people survive the domes we cannot yet prevent. And they carry a deeper meaning too. They remind us that surviving the heat is, in part, a matter of caring for one another, of building communities where the vulnerable are watched over and the danger is faced together. The heat isolates and hides its victims. Human connection is one of the surest ways to drag that danger back into the light. Which leaves one final question. Having understood the danger, having seen the line these domes crossed, what do we choose to do now? We began under a single sky, 200 million people trapped beneath a lid of heat on a summer morning. We have travelled from that morning down into the failing cells of an overheated body, up into the buckled river of wind that pinned the dome in place, out across the drying fields and the overheated oceans, and forward into the futures that branch ahead of us. Now the journey returns to where it must always return, to the choice that sits in front of us right now. The domes over America crossed a dangerous line. Remember exactly what that means. They carried the survival threshold of the human body from a distant theoretical future into a present-day summer, brushing against a continent of ordinary people on an ordinary weekend. They proved that the conditions once confined to the world's most extreme corners can now assemble over the temperate heartland of a wealthy nation, and the science tells us plainly why. A warming world driven by the gases we have added to the sky makes this heat more frequent, more intense, and more humid, pushing that survival line closer to everyday life with every passing year. That is the warning. But a warning is not a fate. The future these domes point toward splits into two very different paths, and the fork between them has not yet been passed. Down one path, the warming climbs without restraint, the survival line advances across more of the map, and the deadly domes grow more common until the times when it is safe to be outdoors begin to shrink. Down the other, humanity brings down the emissions driving the heat, holds the warming in check, and keeps that survival line for most of the world at bay. The distance between those two futures is measured in a number of lives so large it defies imagining. The heat itself has done us one strange favour. It has made the abstract concrete. A warming measured in fractions of a degree is easy to wave away as distant and small. But 100 degrees in a famous park, a night in Maine that would not cool, a survival line brushing against a summer crowd, these we can feel. The domes translated the quiet warnings of the scientists into something written on our own skin, and in doing so they gave us a chance to understand the stakes while the choice still matters. So the question left hanging is the only one that counts. Not whether the danger is real, the domes settled that. Not whether we caused it, the science settled that. The question is whether we will hear the warning while hearing it can still change the outcome. Whether we will treat this quiet, patient, deadly heat with the seriousness it has earned, and act on the root of it before the line these domes approached becomes a line we cross again and again. The heat dome over America was a message, written across a continent. It told us the danger has arrived, The line has been reached and the future is still, for now, unwritten. What we make of that message is up to us, and the time to decide is the summer we are living in, not some cooler year that is never coming back. The dome has spoken, the line is drawn. Now we choose which side of it our children will live on. Look up at the sky, feel the weight of the heat, and understand what it is telling you. The warning could not be clearer. The choice could not be more ours. Decide.